Okay. I'll start my speech in three, two, one. Several setup that actually coming from the opening of positions, right? Number one, we think that actually our goal in the very first place is very easy, that we want to allow the production and consumption of meat simply because of we are knowing that actually meat in the very first place is really have the accessibility in terms of the economic, society need, etc. Right? But the problem in here is what the government are trying to propose is only make the instable much likely to be happens, and the scarcity of the food is much likely to be happen, right? So the solutions that we are trying to offer is we are trying to stick with the current status quo, but we additionally we want to put more mechanism in here, which is how actually the government in the first place is have to an obligations to give much educations and knowledge to society and how actually they can try to maximize the nutritions that they should get or gain in the very first place, right? This mechanization to begin with can try to counterbalance the overconsumption concern coming from the opening government to begin with, right? That's why with actually this mechanization is very important, right? Rebuttal that we want to give towards the opening government two things. Number one, they are trying to say that actually the current status quo, most likely this action is very immoral because you have to kill them and continuously and so on and so forth, right? To response of this, number one, we think that actually this is completely untrue. Notice that actually the current status quo, social norm and everything is never tried to say that actually this is immoral. This is immoral, right? Because simply we are knowing that actually this is completely okay. Notice that actually this animal in the very first place is really have a high reproduction abilities. For example, when we're talking about chicken, basically they could reproductive until 20x in the very first place in the short term or in the short period and so on and so forth, right? That's why we think that this is completely okay for us in the very first place. But second response, even if the argumentation about this is true, we think that actually these people will not try to killing them in the suffer because they are knowing about the procedure, how they could killing the cow in order for them to get the meat and so on and so forth. We don't have to make them suffer, right? Because there's a procedure for these people in the first place. So we think that actually the argumentation about this immorality and so on and so forth is cannot be standing any longer in this debate. Number two, they are trying to provide the analysis that actually this is not exclusive for us to eat meat. Notice that actually there's lots of the alternative of nutritions that we can get, right? To the response of this, number one, we should agree that actually maybe the meat in the very first place is not really exclusive because of the nutrition can be replaced from the other food and so on and so forth. But what we need to understand, basically this meat is very exclusive when we're talking about the food supply, right? Because this will increasing the available of the food supply to begin with, right? Because if we are relying on the OG kids when they are trying to talking about the vegetable, talking about the fruit and so on and so forth, basically those kind of stuff is really depends on the season itself, right? Most of the vegetable or fruit is not working or it cannot be grow in a certain season, but it can be applied only in the other season and so on and so forth, right? By that means the food supply even more scarcity because of we have to rely on the season itself, and that's why the vegetable and fruit and so on and so forth is not very sustainability in the very first place, right? Meanwhile, when we have the meat in the very first place, at the very least, we have the trade-off that these people have much food supply that is very available, right? Second, within the edges, they are trying to explain when talking about vegetable and fruit, it will be very risky. Notice that there's a loss of the pest that actually can be happens. There's a loss of failure in growing about this vegetable and fruit and so on and so forth. So again, this is not sustainable to begin with, right? Even if the argumentation about this is true, within the edges, this is still the options, right? Because the government cannot be intervened about the people options of life. The government cannot be intervened towards how actually the society are being overconsumption and so on and so forth, right? Even that they want to say that actually the food supply have to be balanced, even they want to say that actually the people have to balance their nutrition and so on and so forth. Well, the mechanization is not banning it, but try to educate them in order for them to knowing how to balance it out in the very first place, right? That's why we think actually the solution in the very first place is educating them and not banning the production and the consumption at all, just because we all want to achieve the balancing that opening government are trying to pursue, right? That's why this argumentation is cannot be standing any longer in the opening government case, right? Continue to my argumentations. There are two argumentations that I will try to pursue in this debate. Number one is why this is very unjustified for the government to intervene towards the people choice, and number two, why this is harm towards the society as the whole, right? So the first argumentation within the edges, if they want to balancing again within the actually education is very important, right? Because educations will make them more aware towards the consumption, towards the nutrition and so on and so forth, right? This awareness could lead into changes in the consumption behavior simply because of they are knowing about the consequences if they are being over consumptions on meat and so on and so forth, right? This is can really counterbalance the concerns that coming from our government about how actually people are being over consumption to meat because of it's very delicious and tempted and so on and so forth, right? But number two, we think that we need to be understand most of the production and consumption of meat is happens in the developing country, right? Meaning, for example, this developing country are trying to using the meat in the very first place using for export and imports are really rely on this is because of maybe the amount of it is very big and so on and so forth, right? But exactly because of the people are really or rely on this job and so on and so forth, even you are trying to give them a mechanization that actually the government will put much time for the people in order for them to pursue the other job and so on and so forth. But actually these people are still really hard to get the other job. Notice that actually the job in the very first place in the developing country is very scarcity. Notice they have much competition because of when we're talking about the meat industry is not a small industry, it is a big industry, and there's a lot of the people are living that, are get the job on that, and suddenly you are trying to ban it, meaning that actually there's lots of the people that are just being unemployed, a lot of the people are trying to competing, even you are trying to spend time and so on and so forth, right? That's why the mechanization to begin with is cannot be standing in this debate, right? Number two, what the things that actually will be harm or impactful to society as the whole, right? Two things. Number one, we think that actually this would lead into much scarcity. Notice that actually three things. Number one, vegetable and fruit is only happens in their seasons. It's only cannot be grown in the other season and so on and so forth. Number two, it's much risk. Notice there's a pest and so on and so forth. Number three, we think that actually vegetable, fruit and so on and so forth is really have a limited time, right? Notice, for example, like when we're talking or taking the food or vegetable, it's only survive for 1 until 2 days before it's dead, and there's no nutrition at all from this vegetable and so on and so forth, right? The inventory or how we are trying to collect it, it's really have a really short time to begin with, right? That's why we think that actually scarcity will much bigger simply because of we are too relies on this vegetable and so on and so forth. Meanwhile, when we are have the meat production still, at the very least, this meat in have the accessibility, we just try to counterbalance to make it the food supply have much balance and so on and so forth, right? That's why we think that it is very okay for us to using or still have the production and consumptions of the meat in order for us to balance out the food supply and so on and so forth, right? Number two, we think that actually this can impact towards the economic, right? Notice that actually food and beverage most likely are using the meat and suddenly are trying to change drastically because of you are trying to use this food and vegetable, right? It will impact towards the investor who are trying to invest their money into this food and beverage sector. Notice that actually they are knowing that this food supply in the very first place, like vegetable, fruit, and so on and so forth, is very risky. It is have a short time period of inventory and so on and so forth. That's why most of the people will try to be afraid or not try to invest in the food and beverage sector, meaning that actually the much of the scarcity that I already explained will most likely to be happens in the very first place, right? That's why we think that actually this is very harm if we are trying to ban it. Again, if the conscience of the opening government or goal of the opening government is trying to balancing of the nutrition and so on and so forth, the solution is not banning it, but the solution is how we are trying to educate them to in order for them aware and understands that they should balance it in the very first place. Probably to propose the oppose this motion. Thank you.